Okay.
So what I'm doing right now is rereading everything so I can get ready to do your videos. I'm trying to figure out where to start, but I figured I'd just start at the first, at the beginning where it all starts. And it doesn't. In the Eddas, it doesn't start with the creation of the world. That comes later. What I'm discovering is, much like in any story, the Eddas are a story. They're a collection. And so the first part is called the Fooling of Gylfe. And King Gylfe is, I think he's the king of Norway, Denmark at the time. I'll have to relook. But he goes,
just hanging out?
He wants to go to Asgard and ask questions because he's very fascinated by the Asa race. The Asa race are, of course, those that live in Asgard, the gods, and the people that came out of them. More on the Asas later, because there's a whole journey that the Asas undertake before they even get to Asgard. So King Gylfe goes by the name Gangler here, and he does this to fool the gods, but the gods know he's coming, so they're just kind of humoring him at this point.
Nice.
They don't bother correcting him at all through his conversations. They just like, yeah, you're Gangler now. That's who you are. So, his first thing is he asks of
just one car back. Bathrooms are downstairs. Pretty much it. All right, welcome aboard.
Who lives in Asgard? Who owns the burg or the city? And they, of course, there's a man he meets outside the Great Hall who's juggling like 9 swords. He's so dexterous or something like that. And he takes him inside the burg or the hall, and King Gylfe's saying, I'm going to refer to Gylfe as King Gylfe, but the name Gangler is funny to me. But
yeah.
So King Gylfe, he goes in and he sees people drinking, feasting, fighting, and then he sees 3 thrones, and on those thrones he sees 3 men, and he asks the guy who's escorting him in there, like, who are those men? He goes, those are the kings of Asgard. It's not Odin. Although the more I read, I think it might have been Odin in 3 forms, because a lot of times Odin is referred to as the threefold god, or the hanged god. There's 3 eras of his life. He is wanderer, warrior, and sage.
Yeah.
So the names of these 3 kings are Hard, Jafnar, and Thraid. And Gangler is speaking to these guys, and he's asking them all questions about who's the greatest among you got the Asas, and they say, well, Allfather, and he has so many names. Let's see. The Allfather, he is known by Haron, or Nikar, or Nikuz, or Fjolnir, Svrengir, Vindir, and I might be fucking these pronunciations up all over the place, but I'm trying my best. And Yalg are like the 12 names of Odin, or the Allfather. And then he goes in to talk about how the creation of the world goes. Like, after they talk about how Odin, who is the greatest in Asgard, and they say Odin the Allfather, and then he says, well, how did the world come to be? And then they launch into how the world comes to be. And what surprises me, what I find most interesting about this is that the 3 kings, they speak in turns, but they finish each other's thoughts like they're one mind finishing a sentence. They're not talking over each other. They're not interceding a different point. They're all on the same page. They all know the story, and they're just like, it's like listening to one person speak, which is why I think those 3 kings are Odin in disguise. That's just my theory. I've never read or heard anything else about that, but it's a little interesting theory I like to come up with. That the 3 kings that Gylfe meets in the hall, in the Great Hall in Valhalla, might be Odin in disguise, because he knows that King Gylfe's coming in disguise. It makes if you're going to be in disguise, I'm going to be in disguise too. That's, I think, very much up Odin's alley. then then he talks about the creation, how it came to be, and the three kings started talking to him about how in the beginning there was Muspelheim and Niflheim, and those were the only two. Oh, and the Ginnungagap, which is a great void in the middle, or also known as just the gap. And in the south was Muspelheim with its raging heat, and in the north you had Niflheim with its bitter cold. And the heat from Niflheim the heat from Muspelheim met the cold from Niflheim, and they started interacting. And from that interaction was born a giant named Ymir, evil giant. It's said in the Eddas. And Ganglir says, well, how did that giant, live? What did he survive off of? And then the three kings were like, well, oh yeah, there was a cow named Alblema that was also formed. And that cow had 4 teats that fed Ymir. And Ganglir was like, well, what did the cows live on? And they're like, oh, the cow licked the salt from the Rhine off the ice in Niflheim. And on the first day, a man's hair was, found, and on a second day, after another licking, a nose, and on the third day, after another day of licking, a whole man popped out, and that man was Bor, the first of the gods. He's the father of Odin. It's also important to note that there's something that is not discussed that I think is very interesting in the Eddas, that there is a creator god, one over Odin, and he is only referred to as Fimbulter. He is there at the very beginning. He's the one who created the gap and the two worlds, and then you never hear of him again. Never, until after Ragnarok. More on that later. So, Bor, father of Odin, marries a giant, or a Jotun. And that's where the mingling of the blood first starts, and the Asas and the Jotuns mingle their blood all the time. And there's such a bitter feud between the two races. But they fall in love with each other all the time. I think it's funny. That reminds me of a story, the Lament of Frey, which I'll talk about later. But one of my favorite stories. So Bor marries a giantess, and they give birth to 3 sons: Odin, the All-Father, Vile, and Ve. And they kill Ymir. And then from Ymir's corpse, they make the world. Of his blood, they make the oceans and the rivers. Of his flesh, they make the earth. Of his bones, they make the stones and the pebbles. Of his eyelashes, they make a bulwark surrounding Midgard, or Earth. And then of his brains, they make the clouds. And Ganglir is just awestruck at all of this, how the creation was made. And then it goes on to, he says, well, how was the first men made? How did man come to be? And the 3 kings then say, well, after the creation of the world and formation of Asgard, which, by the way, Asgard, the city, was not made by Odin. After all, according to the Eddas, it was made by his brother, Vili. Or the Ve? One of the two. I'll look that up. So they were walking down the seabank one day, and they found 2 trees. And from these trees, they gave life. Each of the brothers poured something into the trees, from consciousness to motor skills to eyesight to thought, and they made a man. And the first man was named Osk, and the first woman named Embla. And from those 2, all humans are derived. And that's pretty much the creation story.
That's really interesting.
I mean, it's like the really bad Cliff Notes version of it, but
Yeah, but that's what I would rather hear than having to read it all.
Yeah.
Nowadays, especially. So what book is like that?
Oh, this is the Prose Edda, but it's a complete edition of the Prose Edda. It was published in in the 1800s. It was first compiled and really comprised by a doctor in the University of Michigan, actually. And in this version, you find all English, Germanic, Latin translations of the prose and poetic Eddas. Plus, there's writings in here that called forwards and afterwards, which they didn't have the author's name. They're mostly unknown authors, but they felt that their writings were good enough to include them in this book. And the forwards and the afterwards come after each chapter, each story, so to speak, and they're explaining their interpretation of how it connects to the real world. For instance, the creation story has this long forward about how it kind of connects to the real world, and that Asgard might actually be the city of Troy, which was destroyed way back, because in the ancient world, Troy was the jewel of the world. It was the best city ever built. So that author tried to connect the idea of Asgard to Troy, and the king of Asgard to the Allfather Odin, and he tried to connect the hero Hector to Thor. So I like those little forwards and afterwards. I don't put much stock in them, but they're nice things to think about, and it really helps to expand on the stories. Like, well, how does that really relate to the real world, So I like that.
Yeah.
That's all I got.